Greetings, brethren. It's been a while since I have made a video, and so today I want to talk about solutions and kind of just open up a channel for that. To start off, I use the word brethren in the sense of kind of a warm, ideologically aligned, familial type greeting. Not necessarily having to do with one gender or the other. So where to start? Solutions. What is the problem? First, we define a problem and then we talk about solutions. So, the problem. Well, there are many problems that can divide us and turn one against another. And warfare is the most destructive and perhaps evil of the problems, which are the expressions of this nature of man against man, woman against woman, destruction, evil. And currently, we see a flourishing of war in the world. Perhaps there could be a narrative which says that post World War II there was a certain kind of world order which prevented wars from breaking out in the world, and that order is being challenged and is less ordered, and as a result all of these wars are flaring up. However, there are failures in that hypothesis, insofar as there were many wars in the interim region between World War II and today, and many of them were waged by the hegemon, being the United States. There was wars in Vietnam and Korea and Iraq, and then Afghanistan and Iraq again, and many other, Libya, Syria, many others, smaller conflicts throughout the world, but lots of war nonetheless. It's just that the way that those wars were presented to the populace who's mostly going to be receiving this message, they weren't conveyed as a problem. They were conveyed as if they were a solution, as if the wars were a solution to a problem, like the spread of communism or a dictator doing bad things, and therefore democracy needs to come in and fix the dictators and the communism, or terrorism, and we need to conquer with democracy in order for that to end. And even if those are lies, if they're convincing and the people believe it, it becomes true for the people. And therefore, a narrative can hold. Because what's more important for the ruling class is not the truth. It's what truth they can get people to believe, to take on as true. If you can convince someone of a lie, that lie becomes their truth, even though it's a lie. And they will treat it as their truth, and they will align their reality around that lie and make it true relative to them. There have been 2 wars in the recent past that have caused me to divide against my brethren, or seeming brethren, and to lose friends over, seeming friends, people that I would have referred to as friends, lost over these wars. The first one being the COVID war, and the more recent one being the war in Palestine, or that's just or Gaza, or Israel, or Canaan, or whatever you want to call the geographical region. It's basically a war against a people and masquerading as a religious war. Religions, on their own, a good religion, if I'm to define a good and a bad religion, a good religion is one that brings people together and brings them closer to union with all. And a bad religion is one which divides and fosters war. And these wars are propagated through propaganda. Without the propaganda, the propagation of the war is ineffective, because the support of the general populace is necessary in order to perpetuate the state of war. As an example, what's going on currently in Yemen and the surrounding regions is a people who have become acclimated, who have been accustomed to war, because war has been waged on them for decades. And as a result, war is a part of their way of life. It's their normal. And their truth is that the war is waged upon their people from foreign enemies. And those foreign enemies want nothing more than to kill them. And therefore, it's their glory, it's their honor to be able to engage those foreign enemies and to cause damage to them. And so you have the Houthis, who are on one hand, the foreign enemies will call them a terrorist organization, but the local populace will call them a liberation movement, a people's militia. And it's the same dichotomy exists in Palestine with Hamas. That the foreigners who are trying to kill them call them terrorists, and the people themselves view them as a militia, a liberation movement, those who are fighting for them. So you have these black and white scenarios where there is inherently division relative to how a situation is spoken about. Because if you speak about one of those realities or the other, then it seems like you're taking a side. And if you're taking a side and someone else is on the other side, then it seems that the divisions of warfare have extended to the person who is in communication, and therefore those two people are at war. And how can people at war be friends? And therefore friendships end because of a war. And beyond that, because of propaganda. Because without the propaganda, there wouldn't be the division of mentality which is adopted that creates the strife amongst brethren. And so, to be able to speak of both sides as true in their own right, objectively, is a way of communication which can bring integrity, which can bring education and communication conversation. And when we pick a side, it can lead to the opposite, lead to division and warfare. And then there's the aspect of truth as opposed to relative truth and propaganda. So I want to go back to COVID. So there are two sides in COVID. There are the people who believe the propaganda, and there are the people who don't believe the propaganda. And it's the same for the other wars as well, but COVID will prove an example for what I'm trying to get to. So the people who believed the COVID propaganda, they believed that those who didn't follow the guidelines or the mandates, whether that's wearing masks or getting an experimental injection, that those people are then become threats to those who believe the propaganda because they exist in a state of fear of a hypothetical disease. And because they fear this disease so much, the only way they can feel like they're not in a state of fear is if everyone around them complies with the same mandates that they have been convinced are the solutions to the state of fear which they have been propagandized with. So you'll have people who say, don't come in here if you're not wearing the mask, or you can't come to my house if you're not injected with this experimental procedure. And so the other side is the people who don't believe the propaganda, who are not afraid of the hypothetical disease, and who refuse to submit to these mandates because they are not propagandized with the fear. They don't believe it, and so they're not going to then subject themselves to these control measures as a result of a problem they don't see as a problem. So they're not going to comply with the mandated hypothetical solution to the hypothetical problem. So the middle ground, of course, as I've said, is to objectively respect each perspective and to tolerate both, and then to navigate a middle way without necessarily rejecting one group of people or the other. And so this can be referred to as tolerance. So tolerance can be seen as a virtue. However, if what is being tolerated is a behavioral pattern which is mandating something that's not in your best interests, and then is forcing you to not, or to withdraw your right to go to a grocery store. So that's what happened to me, is that I didn't comply with the mandates, and therefore I was not able to then go to the grocery store. And for a lot of people, it meant their jobs. If they didn't comply with getting an injection of this experimental new type of medical intervention, that they would lose their jobs. So their livelihood in both situations is potentially jeopardized if they don't comply. So if we are to tolerate that behavioral pattern in society, then we tolerate something that is jeopardizing our own livelihood. So in that circumstance, the toleration is no longer a virtue, and the virtuous thing to do is to take a stand against that behavioral pattern. So, to do what one can to reject it. So not tolerance. So you can see how that's similar to a form of warfare. It's not necessarily as violent as warfare, even though someone who no longer has an income or no longer has access to food, that's a form of violence that could lead to their death. Yet it's not like shooting each other or fighting each other outright. It's like an indirect form of warfare. So in that case, it gets to a point where the tolerance is is no longer a virtue, and it becomes a necessity to pick a side. Because without picking a side, you either end up getting, like in my situation, I either get denied, and I can't say I'm objectively neutral, and maybe I tried to, well, I think in my circumstance, it's like I tried to tolerate those who went along with the programming and the COVID agenda up until the point where they were directly threatening my well-being. They were denying me access to food to try to starve me. And when I would go out in public, people would throw me out of the public venue, just like in the civil rights movement, how black people would be thrown out of being served because of their nature. And when I would go, it got to a point where people were threatening bodily harm in public, and luckily it never got to that point of actually people physically assaulting me and having to physically defend myself. But I think that it would have gotten to that point if I hadn't had taken a stand. And then we can relate with what's going on in the Middle East, where there are peoples who are downtrodden, who have been warred against for decades, had famine and blockades, and they've been sanctioned and quarantined and just had awful circumstances. In Yemen, there's hundreds of thousands of people who have starved and died of these various diseases as a result of the US and Saudi Arabia and other of the empirical allies of their genocidal war against the Yemenis. And so is it virtuous to have tolerance for that, to tolerate people who will subsidize those actions, those behaviors? Solutions. What are the solutions? So, if we are not to subsidize the warfare, the genocide, what does that look like? If every time that we vote, that vote is a communication, is a signal sent to say that this system represents me. Even if I vote for someone who doesn't get elected, I vote for that system no matter who gets elected, and that system represents me no matter what it does, no matter how egregious its warfare, its genocidal actions, its repression, oppression, no matter how much it diverges from my ideology. So long as I continue to vote, that system represents me in everything that it does. And what if one doesn't vote? It's not going to make that system go away. It simply means that energetically one isn't consenting. And not just consenting, but subsidizing with one's integral choice, one's being, one's sovereign right of themselves to represent themselves. They're relegating that right to represent themselves onto this government which represents them, and then everything the government does is in their name, whether they voted for the current administration or not. That's what it means to vote. And to pay taxes is an energetic vote. It says I'm going to energetically pay into this thing, to consent to everything that it does, and I'm going to subsidize it with the fruits of my life energy to pay for what it's doing. So for that reason, I cannot vote, I cannot pay those taxes, because it would be part of the problem, and I don't want to subsidize the problem. I want to be part of the solution. And food is just another vector of warfare against the populace, essentially, where food has been weaponized, just like the medical system has been weaponized to deride the health of the people in order to capitalize on the spending that results from their diseased state of being, their derided lack of integral health. And a solution to that is to produce one's own food, is to source one's food from healthy integral sources, which in many circumstances is local farms. Some people will choose to go to a Healthy Living or a Trader Joe's or a insert healthy store here, a farm market. A farm market is a better example, but oftentimes these health stores are just another form of capitalizing upon people's propaganda, and what they're selling isn't really healthier at all. It's just propagandized as healthy, propagandized as healthy, as organic, as natural, when it's just another form of advertising and there's not really anything different about the product. One thing that's great about Vermont is that Vermont created this non-GMO labeling. So whenever you see a product in a store that has the label that says non-GMO certified, that's because of Vermont, and only because of Vermont, because Vermont passed the legislation so that it became worthwhile for all the companies that don't include genetically modified food in their products. They'll label them as such so that they can be sold in Vermont. What I haven't seen, when the things do have genetically modified organisms as part of the food product, they don't advertise it. They might have to put a disclaimer to say it, but they don't advertise it. So it kind of, and you could say that's another form of propaganda if it's unknown, insofar as, is it really negative for one's health to consume a genetically modified? It may not be objectively known what is true, but what is known is that we adapt and evolve over time to become capable of digesting various foods, which is why there's the percentage of population in the United States that can digest peanuts is a lot higher than the percentage of Africans that can digest peanuts, because there has been more peanut cultivation and consumption in the United States, and therefore people have adapted to that in singular lifetimes and then evolved over multiple lifetimes to become tolerant to the bacteria or the potentially intolerable things that go along with peanuts. And so there's a greater intolerance or peanut allergy in the population that is not exposed to peanuts. And so as a general trend, what we're exposed to, we develop an ability to be immune to. And if we are isolated from various stimuli, input, pollen, bacteria, whatever, if we never face that, we never develop a natural immunity to it. And developing the natural immunity is what causes us to be healthier, because we're able to be healthy in a wider environment. If it's like relative to pollen, if you don't have a tolerance to pollen and you have a big pollen reaction, then in the seasons where there's a lot of pollen, it's going to limit where you can be, and it means you have a decreased potential for health, because you have fewer options of where to go in the world without having this reaction. And if you have a wide palette of things that you eat, then you can travel widely throughout the world and eat the local cuisine with little concern. But if not adapted to that, you have to stick. You become intolerant. So the capacity to expose ourselves to various pathogens increases our tolerance and our state of health. And say there's something toxic, if we continue to have that, like snake venom, if someone who's gotten bitten by a snake many times, they build up or stung by bees many times or whatever, or they build up a tolerance to that venom, so it affects them less. So in this way, it's important to not bury our heads in the sand to what's going on. It's important to be aware of the various states of warfare that are going on, the problems in the world, because without being aware of the problem, we're not able to develop an immunity to the problem, to heal as a result of it. So for a time, going back to COVID, I was tolerant of people who were pushing the COVID agenda. But once it got to the vaccination of, and I shouldn't use the word vaccination, because what people took were not vaccines up until up until they changed the definition of vaccines. So vaccines had a certain definition, and if you keep with that definition up until 2020 or 2021, when they changed the definition, what they mandated everyone take, they are not vaccines. They're a medical procedure, which they had to change the definition of a vaccine in order to call them a vaccine. And if you're going to go along with every time an authoritarian system changes the definition of a word, and you're not going to, then there's no basis of truth, there's no basis of reality or communication, because the very words will be redefined to fit the agenda of that system. So they'll read, if the system wants you to take a poison, but they are only able to mandate a vaccine, but they have the power to redefine the poison as a vaccine, then they have a power to mandate the poison, because they can just call it something else. And so those who go along with that, they take a poison called a vaccine. The fact that it's called a vaccine doesn't make it any less poison. It's just a different name for the thing. So for a time I could tolerate those who pushed that agenda, and then there was a time where I couldn't tolerate it. And that's when I lost people who used to be friends, who were bought into that propaganda agenda. And it turns out that some of them have circled back, but some of them are no longer friends. And it is what it is. I could say it's sad, but it's not sad. I respect their choice to choose that propaganda over a friendship. And similarly with the warfare going on in the Middle East, there are those who support the empire's agenda of, I'll self-censor myself, I guess, even though there's a certain awareness of words that result in censorship and that which doesn't result in censorship. And I've been subject to censorship many, many times in the past years. Most of it has been due to the COVID war, but there has been censorship relative to the war in Ukraine, Russia and Ukraine, to a much lesser degree, but there has been censorship there. And the censorship in relation to the war in the Middle East is just ramping up, and I think it's going to get a lot more serious. There's going to be a lot more censorship going forward on that subject, and I might even have past videos that I've made removed, and I might get strikes for past videos I make, because the way that their censorship rules is that they're retroactive, and then the AI will search the transcripts of all the past videos, and you'll be punished for something that happened in the past, even if the thing that happened in the past wasn't maligned with their current propaganda censorship rules or whatever. They apply it retroactively, and because the purpose is not, the purpose is to create a monoculture, to create a profitable monoculture. That's the whole purpose of the industrialized society, and it applies to the food and how the food is produced. It applies to the medical system. It applies to the educational system. It applies to the media array of the propaganda that they give people, and the mentality of the people. So they want a monoculture. They want to flatten the curve. So a bell curve demonstrates the natural sort of pre-inclination, or the natural array of nature. So if you have a bell curve relative to people's intelligence, or relative to their running speed, or relative to their awareness on a certain subject, like it almost always ends up in a bell curve, where you have the people on one end who are less aware or less capable. You have the majority of people near the middle, which is closest to the average, and then you have people on the other side of the curve who exceed the average. So the industrial monoculture, which is represented by the cult of science, wants to flatten the curve. It wants to make everything the same, and it wants to deny the natural variability. So if they take a blood test of someone and then they see all these figures, they apply all those figures to the center of the bell curve. And if anyone's figures relative to all the different things they test in a blood test are outside of the bell curve, then that's an opportunity for them to profit by normalizing the state of that individual down to their very blood. So then they'll prescribe some sort of medicine, which is a drug. So drugs are sold in drug stores, and drug dealers are a monoculture of people wearing white coats. Whether they are employed in a pharmacy or whether they are employed in a hospital, all the drug dealers are standardized in the color of the coat that they wear. And the system of industrial monoculture wages war against those outside of that standard model. So those who practice medicine, natural medicine, they're labeled as witches, and they're burned at the stake, or they are chased out of the town, or there's a lot who have been killed, especially during the whole COVID war. There are hundreds of naturopaths who died in mysterious circumstances, literally killed, or take their license away so that they can't continue to practice. The very practice of requiring a license in order for health to be dispensed is a mechanism of control, of creating a monoculture. So the drug dealers will prescribe a drug, and then you'll get it from the drug salesman really will prescribe the drug. You'll get it from the drug dealer at the pharmacy, at the drugstore, and then you'll have to take this drug for the rest of your life in order for you to have a mentality of being healthy by the standards of a monoculture, which derides those who deviate from the center of the bell curve as being sick. When in fact, when we look at nature, it is the monoculture that is sick. It is the lack of deviation. It is the lack of diversity that where the sickness is found. That is the breeding ground for sickness. When you have a field with only one crop, any disease that is able, or pest, any bug, any life form, whether it's a bacteriological life form or whether it's an insect life form or whatever, that is able to thrive in that environment will thrive. And so there's no diversity to counter that inherent potential. And so the result from the industrial monoculture is to make that monoculture so toxic that life cannot thrive there. So they'll make terminator seeds that will kill the bugs that eat the seeds, and then they'll feed the fruit of those seeds to the people. They'll spray the monoculture array with toxic substances that will kill all the life forms, and that will be the food source that they feed to the life forms that are their customers. So that poison becomes the food. The food is poison because the method of the monoculture which produces the food is inherently toxic. So the food is poison, the medicine is, or drugs, the medicine are drugs which are poison, and yet the propaganda is mental poison, and it will get people to subsidize warfare against their brethren while convincing them that they're doing it in some sort of jihad of crusade of democracy, that we're spreading democracy upon the land. And what is democracy but a monoculture of representation, so that all of the people in all of their varieties of expression and political views are all represented in a singular form which exists as a monoculture. Because whatever the government does, when there's different parties, pretty much what the government does is the same, and everything that it does becomes representative of the whole variety of people who choose to vote and subsidize that system. And people will champion democracy left and right as if it's this virtue, when what they're championing is toxicity, industrial monoculture, and warfare. There is nothing virtuous, healthy, positive about democracy. It is a vile disease which is infecting the planet. So the solution is not to practice, to not worship, to not subsidize, to not self-immolate oneself in the support of the toxic monoculture, industrial, empirical, viral disease that infects all of life and the people. Yet, when one becomes responsible, with that responsibility, there is a burden. So ignorance is bliss, and when one is responsible, there is a burden that comes with it. And so it's incentivized to be ignorant, to be blind, to be irresponsible, to work away the time that you have available to you, and then in your limited free time to consume drugs that the system pushes on you, so you can have a short limited span of material bliss that is felt, so in between the long periods of spiritual subjugation and subsidization of that toxic monoculture. And so what is an alternative? What else can we do? All that we can do is lead by example. And in order to gain awareness of how to lead a healthier lifestyle, we can look to those who are offering guidance insofar as how to do that. So I look to people like Glenn Greenwald and Candace Owens and Russell Brand and Luke Rudkowski and Tucker Carlson and many others, people who provide intellectual food, spiritual food. They provide truth in a certain form that can help me. There's a number of creators of musical creators, or people like blacksmiths or mechanical people or people who are living off grid. All like a lot of these I watch via YouTube. All of these various independent people who are they're leading by example in their own life, and in that way they inspire others. So Mike Reynolds being the progenitor of the whole Earthship movement, being a way of building which is ultimately regenerative by recycling waste materials and creating living oases out of what would otherwise be trash. It's just such a beautiful method of that. Ron Paul being an ideological kind of North Star in a sense of liberty and truth and ideological consistency over many decades, and the capacity to be tolerant while also taking a stand, to be within a congress of people of a monoculture and to vote against the monoculture time and again for decades, to stand out from that herd mentality and to stand on principles of truth or the Constitution, or principles of health, or to put ideology, to put truth above the tendency of normalcy bias, of that monocult mentality. Ron Paul is just an excellent example of that. Michael Reynolds is an excellent example of that insofar as a way of living and in creating structures. And that's all that anyone can do, is to lead by example and to learn from the other people who are leading by example in order to set the best example that they possibly can. So of course that's what I'm doing. I'm setting the best example I can set. I'm doing what I can to try to communicate to others whatever might be valuable that I have to offer. And that's largely why I make these videos. And I guess ultimately that's the conclusion of Solutions, is just leading by example and then doing what one can to share their offering and try to inspire others. And I guess that's the end of this video. And if there's any feedback or comments, or people want to kind of, all of the feedback, all of the comments helps to guide me as far as what I'm providing that has value to other people, so that going forward I can continue to provide that value to the audience that chooses to tune in to this message. So that's all for today. We're just about at the 1/3 mark through the winter, and I figured out a temporary solution for the water feature. I have killed 3 rats with rat traps, and I think I've killed all of them because I haven't seen any more rat signs. 2 of them were in the chicken coop, and then there was that one that I think was the one that had punctured that water feature. And otherwise, I'm just enjoying the winter hibernation season, and the silence and the reflection and the introspection and the dream process and all of the rejuvenative aspects that come with this season, and just beginning to look to the season ahead and the exciting prospects that exist. So that's all for now, and I'll talk to you another time.